Hi, this is Dr. Giobbi. Welcome to the podcast. Today we're going to take a look at the American theorist of personality, Harry Stack Sullivan. Sullivan has the distinction of being the first native-born American to develop a major theory of personality. Initially, Sullivan was attracted to Freudian psychoanalytic theory and later diverted from that theory and developed his own theory called interpersonal theory of psychiatry. His main position is that personality is the relatively enduring pattern of recurrent interpersonal situations which characterize human life. For Sullivan, personality is a hypothetical concept that can only be understood in the context of interpersonal relationships with others. And this interaction with others is what Sullivan refers to as the social field, and that social field is present from infancy through adulthood and is present when people are with us and when people are not with us, when we are alone, because of course we can be with others in our thoughts and our feelings and our fantasies, and quite frequently, we aren't alone. Sullivan grew up in upstate New York and eventually made his professional career between New York City and Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, as both a psychiatrist in hospitals, and eventually coming to be the founder of the William Alanson White Institute of Psychiatry in New York City, which still operates today. Is the main or one of the main training facilities in New York City for interpersonal psychology. Sullivan envisioned the human being as a contained energy system, an energy system with the primary concern of reducing tensions that are created by needs. And the tensions and the different behaviors that the organism uses to reduce the anxiety are experienced in three different modes, three different ways of thinking. Sullivan described human beings as experiencing tension that exists on a continuum, and that continuum consists of either absolute relaxation on one end or euphoria to complete tension and terror on the other end. And there are two sources for this tension. One would be physical needs, such as food and drink, and the other is the anxiety. And that anxiety is a social anxiety that results from threats to an individual's security. When these needs are satisfied, the tension releases. If the needs are not satisfied, a state of apathy can result. Now, these tensions can be reduced through energy transformations, according to Sullivan. And these are behaviors such as physical actions. This transfers the energy, transformation of the energy into satisfactions. It can be accomplished through changes of mental perspective or through fantasizing or thinking or perceiving of things. And the way that one goes about transferring or transforming these energies, satisfying these needs, in other words, through either actions or thoughts or fantasies or memories, is largely learned within a society. And the person learns these techniques as a child within their social setting from their parents and from their family. And there are no innate motivators of human behavior except basic physiological needs, according to Sullivan. People learn to behave as they do through the role models of others in their families. Sullivan referred to anxiety as, quote, the first great educative influence in life. And he felt that this anxiety was learned by the infant from the mother. He spoke of the mothering one. And this was a term that included any or all of the baby's primary caretakers when he referred to the mothering one. So he's using the term mothering as a sort of phrase for caretaking. Sullivan described that the infant comes to learn this anxiety from the mother, from the mothering one, and it's present in the way the mother looks, expresses herself, the disturbance in her look, the tone of voice, the body language. This is how the child learns this anxiety from the mother, and it tries to determine what causes the anxiety, what leads to this anxiety. If it can't do this, it escapes into what Sullivan called somnolent detachment, which is falling asleep. How an infant comes to deal with this anxiety that it learns in the environment is what Sullivan claims is the basis for what we call personality and what he refers to as the self system. Now, earlier I mentioned that Sullivan had described three modes of thinking, three ways of encountering the world, and I'd like to discuss those three and describe them at this point. These three ways are the prototaxic, the parataxic, and the syntaxic modes of thinking. The prototaxic mode of experiencing is what's present at birth, and the infant is in contact with the world in this prototaxic state. It's an undifferentiated state. William James referred to it as raw sensory, raw sensations. And there's no concept of logic, of sequence, of before or after. There's just a momentary state of presence. And this is very rare in adulthood, but it is the basic experience, the prototaxic experience that the infant comes into contact with others through. At about 18 months to 2 years, this is around the same time as Lacan's mirror stage, the child's conscious experience evolves into the parataxic state, or an associational experiential state. And in this mode of experiencing the world, a baby often comes to connect events because they occur together. They can also connect events because of some common detail that they share. Now, Sullivan describes how these parataxic ways of thinking exist and stay with us even into adulthood. And an example of this might be if the child in this youngest age, 2 years of age, 3 years of age, experiences a withdrawal from the parent through silence as a form of rejection, this may remain a habitual parataxic experience of the world in adulthood for that child, for that adult. So the adult could possibly then be viewing silence of another person from a parataxic experience and interpret that as rejection. The final evolved state of or mode of consciousness is the syntaxic state. And in this syntaxic state, it is really linked to the logic that is learned through the grammar, through the language. And this sets in somewhere between 1.5 years to 2 years. The children begin to learn words and are generally accepted accept these words as being reality themselves. So when we have this the actual adoption of language, when the child begins to think through grammar, the child is now in the syntaxic state, which is what dominates most of our modes of consciousness as adults. Now, of course, this syntaxic consciousness of how we experience reality, how we understand the world and how it works, is socialized. So this is learned. And the process through which it is learned, Sullivan referred to as consensual validation. It's achieving some sort of a consensus or an agreement about the world based on other people, and then adopting that and validating it within that group. So reality for an individual becomes a socially constructed entity. And of course, as many groups as we have, or as many interactions and families as we have that many variations of reality. By the age of 10, this syntaxic way of viewing the world, this mode predominates the other two, but both of the modes, the parataxic and the prototaxic, can occur throughout the adult life. When an individual reacts in a way from a prototaxic or parataxic experience, and we're talking typically here of the parataxic view, this kind of habitual pre-syntaxic, pre-linguistic mode of being, this is similar to what Freud describes as the unconscious. Sullivan described the human personality as something that was dynamic, however, had salient features that lasted throughout an individual's lifespan. And Sullivan described certain aspects of the personality, things that one could talk about, these patterns that one could talk about. One is called a dynamism, and dynamism is a habitual pattern of behavior. There is something that's called the personification, which is an image of the self or the image of the other. The self system, which is largely evolves to cope with anxiety, and these are aspects of this an enduring self. So let's take a closer look at these aspects: the dynamism, the personification, and the self system. So Sullivan points out that what we call personality, a person's personality, is identifiable recurrent patterns of behavior that serves as a characterization for an individual. And these recurrent patterns of behavior, these habitual patterns of behavior, Sullivan calls dynamisms. Now, there can be dynamisms that have a biological drive, such as hunger or lust, and those dynamisms are oriented around a certain body organ, such as the mouth or the genitals. But the dynamisms that are particularly human have nothing to do with body zones, but have to do with habitual reactions towards others in our lives. These are the habitual reactions that we adopted in childhood and that survive into adulthood, these dynamisms. So, for an example, if a child hides behind its mothers, this is a dynamism of fear. If there's another individual who exhibits certain cruelty or meanness towards others, this could be a dynamism of malevolence. So a dynamism is a characteristic reaction, a habitual reaction that recurs as a pattern in an individual's life that ultimately comes to identify them as their character. And a dynamism, maybe the most distinctively human dynamism, is called the self system, and we're going to discuss the self system shortly. But just to keep in mind, the self system is the thing that is the characteristic pattern that reduces anxiety in an individual's life. Personifications are images that the prototaxic child develops of itself and of others. So, for example, if you remember in this prototaxic consciousness of infancy, the child doesn't have a distinction of self and other or others, and begins to develop basic personifications or images such as the good mother or the bad mother. The good mother would be a personification an image of the mother feeding or satisfying the child's basic need, or nursed tenderly. The bad mother is the feeling or the experience that the child develops from experiencing the mother's anger or anxiety. But the good mother and the bad mother are separate in the child. They're two mothers. They're not connected into the same mother in the prototaxic experience of consciousness. This reminds me a bit of Jung's archetypes, the development of the archetypes. What we have with Sullivan is a reinterpretation of psychodynamic theory that is, if I could say it, maybe more practical, maybe less fantastic, and even would lend itself more to some empirical testability, perhaps. Now, after the prototypes of the mother and father are developed, then the next closest people in the family that have interaction most with the infant become to develop, and we come to know these people. We develop personifications of these people that are limited to the prototaxical experience, and they last throughout our entire lives. So what we experience of the people in adulthood is not merely that person as an adult, but also our prototaxical experience of them as a personification. And this, of course, can lead to some difficulties because we are continuing to experience that person in adulthood, maybe through the eyes of the prototaxical child. These personifications come to even influence our dealings with others. For example, in the earliest experience with a father, maybe an overly harsh or judgmental father, can serve as the foundation of an experience, a habitual experience of that can be transferred onto other authority figures in life. So here we have a description that Sullivan's proposing for an actual functional description of projection and transference. Sullivan also describes that the personification of good me, of an understanding, a view of the good me versus the bad me starts to develop at this time. And the good me would develop as a personification when the child is feeling rewarded and satisfied with feeding and comfort, and the personification of the bad me would develop when it experiences the mother's anxiety or punishment or disapproval. And these are become integrated into the child at this prototaxical level, and ultimately serve as the foundation for the self-concept that lasts into adulthood. Sullivan claims that in some circumstances, the child experiences a level of anxiety and threat to physical or mental abuse that is so significant that they dissociate from themselves, and a self-personification develops called the not me, and this is a dissociation from oneself. And Sullivan describes, using another Freudian term, the uncanny, that we can come to experience things in our world as being both familiar and unfamiliar simultaneously. This is the uncanny, and this would be the experience of the not me. And Sullivan pointed out that the most serious mental disturbances encounter this not me as being something that's very real. And maybe we can even see this illustrated in things such as multiple personality disorder. Hi, this is Dr. Matthew Giobbi. We're continuing our discussion of Harry Stack Sullivan, the American personality theorist. Next, we turn to Harry Stack Sullivan's concept of the self-system. And the self-system really comes into being as a personified self. That is, it's an integration of the good me and the bad me that occurs after the prototaxic stage of consciousness. The self system also develops out of a habitual coming to terms with reduction of anxiety and reduction of threat that comes from the mother figure. So it's a security operation in Sullivan's terms, it's a habitual way of reducing anxiety and increasing a sense of security that comes about from engaging in infancy with others. So we have two operations of the self-system, two originations, as a security operation and as a personification. Sullivan described how in early infancy and through the fundamental years of development in childhood, as a way of engaging and diminishing anxiety and threats to a sense of safety that the child incurs, the child can use certain coping mechanisms. Somnolent detachment is one that we've discussed earlier. It means falling asleep when things become anxious for the infant. There are a few other ways. Selective inattention. Another is to conform to the behavior that the parent wishes or demands. These are all ways of increasing a sense of safety and cultivating a decrease in an anxiety. Selective inattention is simply failing to notice what is causing anxiety in the child, and this ultimately means that this self-system, in Sullivan's words, determines what is and what we know we're thinking about. In other words, in this earliest stage of development, we begin to develop what we could refer to in cognitive terms as a filter, a way of allowing in and keeping out things that maintain a certain level of feeling of self-preservation and safety. Sullivan describes that one of the consequences in adulthood of limiting one's awareness of what causes anxiety is the lack of development of foresight, which is very valuable in adult coping. We turn now to explore Sullivan's developmental epochs, or his stages of personality development. Sullivan describes 6 distinct stages or epochs of personality development. These include infancy, childhood, the juvenile era, pre-adolescence, early adolescence, and late adolescence. Looking at the first epoch of development, which extends from birth until speech, this is what Stack Sullivan called infancy. It orients around the social interaction with feeding, and that's either the bottle or the mother's nipple. And what develops is an image. Sullivan talks about an image of the good nipple, which is the satisfaction of hunger and anxiety and feelings of safety, versus the bad nipple, which is the act of frustration from the anxious mother, a signal of avoidance. And these become translated into personifications of the good mother and the bad mother. This is either a relationship with feeding that is developing a sense of safety and security, or an experience of anxiety and unsafety. The feature of the next stage or epoch, childhood, which starts with articulated speech and also ushers in the syntaxic mode of consciousness, is social relations with peers, with friends. There is a physical motor interaction with the world, with the environment, that includes things like motor coordination and thumb sucking, which serves as a way of reducing anxiety. There's a fusing together of experiences. For example, good mother, good nipple, bad nipple becomes mother as a a singular object during the syntactic stage. And the good me and bad me and the non-me become integrated to make a more consistent sense of self. This is when we find the advent of language, the statement of no, of me, of mine. Grammar is strongly integrating a permanent sense of pervasive selfness. At this age, the child begins to play with as-if behavior. Sullivan calls this as-if behavior performances, such as dramatization, pretending that one is the parent or one is a grown-up. This is a pretending play that is helping to develop the personality. And Sullivan also talks about a certain preoccupation that children may have with concentrating on a singular activity, and this could be a means of avoiding or dealing with something that causes anxiety and stress in their lives. Now, if a child develops under severe states of anxiety and stress, feelings of unsafety, Sullivan proposed, as did Karen Horney and Alfred Adler, that the child has a sense of unwelcomeness in the world. In fact, he quoted as saying, lives among enemies, and this is referred to as malevolent transformation. This is when these devices such as projection, preoccupation, and dramatization, the as-if, become focused on reducing stress and anxiety in this malevolent transformation. And it's a constant state of feeling that one is under the threat of danger. And this experience of being in a dangerous situation can manifest in adulthood on a continuum from mere suspicion to very severe paranoia. Stack Sullivan distanced himself from using the term unconscious, but at this time he talked about an unwittingness, so an unwitting influence of transferring something that the child wants to do into something that's acceptable by the parents and by society, so the Freudian concept of sublimation. But he refers to this as unwitting. In other words, it's habitual. It comes from a place that the child is not, or the adult is not conscious of. And in this way, it becomes a habitual attitude. Now, this doesn't mean that one's not capable of realizing it. It just means that it happens on an automatic, unwitting, or unvolitional level. The next stage or era is the juvenile era, and the focus now is on making friendships. This is the school years. This is usually the time when a child develops a close bond with another person, a friend, an intimate friend. This is the time in a child's life when things such as stereotypes, ostracism, and disparagement can develop. So stereotypes are some kind of shared personification, and they are handed down from generation to generation. Ostracism can be experienced as well, which is forcible isolation, and that could be belonging to some sort of out-group in the society, a sense of otherness. Also the tendency for disparagement, which is often learned from the parents, and it's a dangerous feature in adulthood. This is putting other people down, feeling competitive, disliking people that might have successes, basing one's own self-esteem on conquering other people. Sullivan says one of the feeblest props for an inadequate self-system is the attitude of disparaging others, the doctrine that if you are a molehill, then by God there shall be no mountains. This is destroying others because their success threatens the self-system. In the pre-adolescent period, this is just before puberty. It's a central time for maintaining a close friendship with someone. This is what Sullivan refers to as chumship, a close friend that one can experiment and learn closeness and tenderness and empathy with. And he said this is very essential for adult healthfulness, to have a close bond in the pre-adolescent epoch. Whereas in the pre-adolescence, the individual chumship, friendship, is focused on an individual of the same sex, typically. For early adolescents, the emphasis is on developing a close relationship with someone of the opposite sex. So this is a period that's physiologically demanding, and the sexual desire, what Stack-Sullivan referred to as lust, of early adolescence, becomes one of the central issues of the child. Now, some issues occur, Sullivan described, if the parents or the caretakers criticize the individual, the child, for their choice in love object, and then there could come a conflict between a safety need and a need for this intimacy. Sullivan also suggests that this could be one of the determinants of homosexuality, where the relationship of chumship becomes transferred into the adolescent lust rather than developing an intimate relationship with an opposite sex partner. The next epoch or stage is the late adolescent stage. And this epoch lasts until the specific social manifestation or distinction of adulthood occurs. And the primary influence and interest in the social setting during this period is cultivating a sense of social responsibility, a sort of devotedness to a larger social project than just the self. This period is also marked by a broadening of one's interaction with others and understanding that there are multiple ways of viewing the world, multiple ways of coming to terms with the world. And so the individual's sense of self expands necessarily within the context of others' sense of self. Stack-Sullivan described an individual who enters into this late adolescence with overwhelming anxiety or sensitivity to anticipating anxiety from earlier childhood and earlier epochs of development, could be plagued with inaccurate personifications and certain restrictions of living that will affect their ability to function as a healthful adult. When Sullivan talks of inaccurate personifications, this includes unrealistic views of the self, stereotyped notions of others, and behaviors that are anxiety avoiding, that diminish one's ability to have free choice and free will. These are what Sullivan's referring to by restrictions of living. And the real virtue that comes from this period is developing a sense of self-respect. And Sullivan said that in order to have respect for others, one has to have respect for oneself. So when we find people who are disparaging others, putting others down, it's typically that they're putting others down for the qualities that they themselves lack or are ashamed of in themselves, this concept that Freud talked about in projection. And so if we develop and cultivate a sense of respect for ourselves, it follows that we then have a respect for others. We don't feel the need to disparage others or criticize them or judge them in order to justify our own self. So we see here with Sullivan's theory, Harry Stack-Sullivan's theory, that we are not talking about biologically based or genetically based origins of personality or of maladaptive personalities or of mental illness. We're seeing a very strongly socially determined sense of self that doesn't exist within the person, but exists between people, an interpersonal theory of personality. And these fit nicely with the work of Erich Fromm, with the work of Karen Horney, and I would even say with the work of Alfred Adler.